Here at home, a win for Canadian travelers at the country's top court this morning and a victory for air travelers. The Supreme Court unanimously dismissed an appeal by a group of airlines that challenged Canada's passenger rights charter.
And here to explain what was at stake is our Parliament Hill reporter, Glen McGregor. Glen, let's talk about what airlines were trying to get the court to basically scrap.
Yeah, this is a little victory for airline passengers who are going to be traveling internationally, and also a victory for the Liberal government that sees that the top court in the country, the Supreme Court of Canada, has upheld its 2019 regulations called the Air Passenger Protection Regulations, also referred to by some as kind of a passenger bill of rights. And those things enshrine some rules for compensation for passengers who were delayed on flights or had their luggage lost or were not allowed to board a flight when it involves circumstances within the airline's control. So we're not talking about big weather shutting down an airport. You don't get compensation for that. But if it's something the airline had control over, then they are under this piece of legislation that the Liberals brought in, required to pay certain rates of compensation. Now, the airlines, that would be Air Canada, Porter, and 16 others, all brought this legal challenge of the legislation. There was a decision from a federal court of appeal in 2022 upholding the law, and the airlines decided to appeal that decision to the Supreme Court of Canada. And the Supreme Court said basically, no, the legislation is fine. But what the airlines had argued was that on international routes, they are already covered by something called the Montreal Convention. This is an agreement that was hammered out in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Canada became a signatory in 2001. Basically, it laid out sort of similar rules and similar standards for compensation for in the case of delays and also in the case of lost luggage. What the Supreme Court said, though, was no, the airlines are wrong on this, because just because we have an international agreement with other countries doesn't mean we can bring in our own legislation and enforce it even on involving international routes. So the legislation will stand. Now, the airlines had warned that this could potentially drive up the costs of flights for Canadians who are flying abroad. And we'll have to see how that's going to play out. Right now, there is no further appeal for this, so this is now becomes the law of the land. The airlines don't have any more legal recourse against this the way the legislation is written now. What it means for passengers is that they will continue to be able to file complaints or seek compensation. The complaint process going through the Canadian Transportation Agency. And since this legislation was put in place, there's been a big jump in the number of complaints that have come in under this new regime. Lots of folks still waiting to get compensation for flights that they say were caused by the airline's actions and not unforeseeable circumstances. So will this actually cause an increase in the costs for international flights? And this could be anywhere outside of Canada. If you're flying to the United States or going down to the Caribbean for a holiday, this could be potentially be covered. We'll see. The international routes tend to be the most lucrative routes for Canadian airlines, and they make a lot of money on these things. It's a very competitive space too, because they're competing a lot against a lot of international airlines as well that don't compete domestically. So we're going to see if Canadian airlines do increase their prices now, their ticket prices because of this. I would guess probably not, but still a kind of a victory for passengers and also for the Liberal governments and its legislation. But some passenger rights groups saying, even though they welcome the decision from the court today, they don't think the regulations that we have in place go far enough. They're much more stringent in Europe. There's a much more greater burden of proof on the airlines to prove that any delays that affect passengers were caused by circumstances outside their control. So we're going to see if the federal government, and we haven't heard anything from the new Transport Minister, Anita Anand, on this, but whether or not she wants to go back and revisit these regulations to beef them up, bring them up to that European standard. Doesn't seem like right now it's a particularly high priority for the government.
Okay, yeah, and a lot of people wanting to travel. Let's hope those prices don't indeed go up. Glen McGregor in Ottawa, thank you for breaking this down for us.
Thanks, guys.